let me start off with a very interesting story about how a boring banker ends up in technology. I started off around 7 years back. I was in Jakarta, doing my regular stuff, just meeting people and trying to scout out different companies. Then what happens is that I was thirsty. Me and my colleague, we went out to a small roadside, moms and pop shop to buy a drink. And what we saw is that they had some sort of a scrap paper where they were actually writing down stuff. So I was very curious about what they were really writing down. And what I realized is that they were actually buying on credit. That means they were buying something today for which they're going to pay back in about a month or probably more. And that sort of struck me that isn't that what was going on in Bangladesh or what was going on in Africa? That's how the thinking pattern began about how to change that thing from paper to something on PC or software. But the problem that we all have is that in emerging countries, it's very difficult to expect people to use softwares or to expect people to be able to use one. Why? Mostly because, lack of education or lack of willingness to actually adapt to something new, which is actually not bad. I mean, that's fairly common in other countries too. Okay, so today, what I'm going to talk about is how we can minimize the disparity between uneducated and so-called poor people to the one that's successful in the eyes of the media, at least. Right, so our world today is pretty much divided into several segments, and one of which you probably know, G7. And then you've got G20, and then the rest. And what's G7 is, for some of you that don't know, G7 is the list of the 7 most richest countries in the world. And then G20 is so-called the wealthy countries, but not necessarily the richest ones. Now, in G7, what happens is that, the color got very different, so it's very difficult to probably notice. So this is G7, right there. So G7 today produces about 25% of world's GDP output. That means if you can buy the whole world, 25% of which comes from the G7. But 10 years back, this used to be 75%. Well, around. But that changed to 25% today. And this is the other G20 countries combined, if you'd like aside from G7, the other rich countries. So that's about 19% today. Now, what's interesting is that this was not the situation just about 10, 15 years back. That means the world's focus was on the rich people. If you got money, everyone's idea or concept was on the basis of how to extract the money out of those people's pocket. No one really cared about the people that had 53%, that produces 53% of world GDP as of today. But back then, 15 years back, this used to be below 20%. Now, what that means is that people like the grocery store owner or the farmers or the fishermen or the rickshaw pullers, they didn't matter. Nobody really cared about them because they thought you could not possibly have extracted money out of them. You could not, in a positive way, of course, to sell something to them. But what's interesting is that perception started to change because people realized that they matter too. But not in a way of how to nurture them to a degree where where you can cultivate their ability and yet marketize your products or services to them. Because everybody thought they're uneducated, they wouldn't, how would you sell software to them? Or how would you sell an advertisement to them? Just like, for instance, the search engines that we got today, like, the big ones, if you look at them, their penetration in the emerging countries is so minimal. Like, they made this, like, very simple, service that they could, so-called improvised people could barely probably use. That's because nobody really cared about them or saw them as a market potential in the past. But about 6-7 years ago, we started to think that that may not be the case if there was a way to inspire those people to use softwares. But the problem is how you do that. I went to several people to talk about it, and they say, forget about it. Don't quit your job. You'd be the stupid person if you quit your job over that kind of idea that you're gonna make the most improvised people to use softwares. You talk about softwares, they'll run away. Well, they were actually right. And let me tell you why they were right. Actually, 45% of the people that we have in Bangladesh, and probably this percentage is pretty much standard in other emerging countries too, 45% are extremely poor over here. Now, when you talk about extremely poor, think about it. You barely are having, you barely can make it like day to day on food. So you barely can eat, and we're telling you about software. Would you listen? You probably won't. You'd probably think like, what are you talking about? I'm thinking about how to get my meal, the next meal. And you probably would come to join different, fairs, charities, just to get a meal. So people that are thinking about meal as the priority or the first, like the most important thing, you talk to them about technology like, oh, you use this is fancy. They'd be like, yeah, that's right. Now, another fun part that happens is that 35% people that we have in emerging countries, that's, again, runabout right for any emerging countries, are barely able to read and write. That means, well, when I say barely able to read and write, literally, they can just sign their name, and that's even shaky. So, someone who doesn't know how to read and write, you expect them to use your smartphone apps or SMS. Wow, that's like far-fetched. That's like 30 years from today, not today. Now, does that mean that emerging countries will stop innovating for the next 30 years and we just wait to educate or train our people up? Just so that, like they're on par where you can actually start cultivating new scopes? Well, there are ways to change that, and we figured one way to change that. And before I get into that obvious solution, let me show you what happens in a typical emerging country situation. The first one that you're seeing over there, that's an NGO. Well, Bangladesh is pioneer for MFI concept. That means even without a collateral, people without, people with extreme poverty can actually borrow money or lend money and start some sort of business, which they often do. And this is the collection process. That means loan collection process. So some person go to a shomiti, that means it's a group of people that gathers around, and they all sort of pay back their own dues to this collector. He's probably very hated because, well, he's actually hated quite a bit. And this guy, what he does is he has this scrap paper, well, it's a book, actually, where he writes down stuff. Now, the borrowers, when they go to that, when they head back to their home, they literally have to wait about a week just to know how much money she has on her saving accounts because she cannot read in most cases, or she's, and so there is that gap between technology and her life, because technology hasn't been able to fulfill her life where she could, without knowing how to read and write, be able to fill up that gap between technology. And then that person here, they're garments workers. They face these similar troubles too. They earn money, they go to do shopping. In most cases, what happens is before the month ends, they run out of cash. And all they have to do is now shop on credit. And once they do that, they go back to the shop in a matter of months. Then what happens is that they realize that the actual amount of money changed. Any of you who probably did credit-based shopping, I mean, would you raise hands, like how many of you did credit-based shoppings? Oh, okay, a lot of you did. So how many of you experienced that the shop guy, the mudi dokandar, when you went to pay, they said something different amount? How many of you experienced that? Like often it's a higher amount. Yeah, honestly, that's right about the percentage in Bangladesh right now. That's about 5%. In reality, it's actually 42% according to World Bank worldwide. That's the crazy thing that happens. In Bangladesh alone, you'd be surprised. We lose $123 million on that thing, on that confusion. Just because somebody wrote something on a scrap paper, that means nothing. It's just some bunch of numbers that anyone can actually produce. And worldwide, that parity is $9 billion, by the way. That excludes China and India. So you can tell how bigger of an issue that has become. And yeah. Oh, well, it always happens due to mistrust, globally. It's really the same story anywhere. It's really the same story. And another one, you want to send money, right? You got so many fancy options, like GPay. You got your mobile phone, you tap somewhere, money goes to some of your friends or some of the services you got. Then you got this ultra-modern technology called Bcash. Well, copied from M-Pesa though, but still, it's a cool option too. You got this, you dial some USSD codes, then you got like 5 steps of English instructions. And you are imagine you are this poor guy from a grocery shop that has to understand all those English steps. Well, they were really intelligent when they designed that UI, definitely. I mean, all these steps, and then what happens is, end of the day, what you do is just remember like 1, 2, 5, 7. That means you send money now. Then you got to say some numbers, right? Like how much money you're sending. So nobody really knows what the heck they were actually doing. They were just doing because they were told that way. Nobody really understood. And that's simply because there was a huge gap between technology and their world. Oops. Oh, yeah. This guy is angry because of that mistrust, by the way. Is it working? Well, it kind of got stuck. Oh, okay. It did go. Okay. So this is going to sound crazy, but let me run you through. How many of you know or use DOS, disk operating system, like back in days? Okay, many of you are probably familiar with what DOS is. It used to be, it was back in the 80s. Well, you had a keyboard, you punch a bunch of codes. Then again, not many people knew how to use a computer back then. I mean, it was very difficult. Learning curve was very high. And then, late 1980s, you had the mouse. Life got a lot easier. So once you had a mouse, obviously you moved to the GUI portion. That means graphical user interface. That means you see what you're doing. So it's like there was a very famous phrase back then, like, see what you get. With GUI, then you got Windows, you got like Mac, iOS, and different other options, where you can actually see what you're doing exactly. Therefore, learning curve got reduced. Now, more and more people, without education, could actually, given a bit of time, probably an hour or probably a day, would be able to actually sort of run through or navigate through that option or that interface. And then in mid-1990s, you had this stylus thing. I'm sure a lot of you used the product called Palm Pilot, right? You had a pen, or probably many of you still do on your smartphone too. Like you stick something out and then you tap something with it. But well, that didn't sell out very well either. Then in 2007, something new came. Well, one guy from Syrian background, did something crazy. People thought he was crazy, but he said something interesting. Your fingertips could be your stylus. Well, you probably know, all of you, of course, know that guy. Anyway, so Steve first, when he said that your smartphone doesn't require a stylus, everybody thought he was, he's nuts, definitely. I mean, without stylus, you're tapping something, it's never going to tap on the right spot. But it did. Now the world changed. User interface or communicating with technology became a lot more easier now. More and more people now can use. Now in 2011, the transition finally started to take shape to a level which we call VUI, or Voice User Interface. So what that means is people started to realize that one way to communicate with your device should be your voice. That means you speak to it. The only problem is the person that the thing that you're speaking to is not a person, it's a machine. Well, to be more precise, it's software. So how do you communicate with the software? How do you tell it to do something that it will do? That means he has to understand your language in the first place. So the challenge began. That challenge brought us to a different level called neuroprogramming or neural networking. That means your software has a brain. It can learn, it can think, it can grow. That means you just build a thing just like human being is produced, well, in a different way, but let's say human being is produced, right? And once it's produced, it learns, just like today's software with AI capability or neural networking. So what it does is it learns by itself. As time goes on, it learns. Now, that's really the missing puzzle, the gap between technology and a normal person that I was talking about. So when I first came with that idea back in 7 years ago, everybody thought, back then nobody was thinking that voice is going to be very big someday. Everybody was like, back then voice technology was still at a novice stage, not at a stage where we are at today. So nobody could minimize that gap on how, connect that gap on, still we are probably struggling on how to connect that gap between that rickshaw puller to a high-tech product. How do we connect that gap? Well, still there is a missing link. That is internet. That guy, these big guys like Google, Amazon, or even Apple, the problem that they all have is their product needs internet. Without internet, you cannot talk to your device. So it has to be connected to an internet. Or else, it will just say really like slurpy things, right? Like, what's your name? Sorry, you're not connected to the internet. Or probably say, my name is this, but sorry, you're not connected to the internet. I don't have access to those info. And get stuck. So, rickshaw puller, he's connected to a 4G network. I think that's still 10, 15 years ahead. It's going to be wishful thinking today. So the question is how to connect that gap. Well, the answer is very obvious. Everybody knew the answer, but nobody just did it. Just like Juliana was saying that earlier, that she tried translating those Tagore songs into Russian, and she realized there was nothing available, so she decided to make one. Exactly that's what I did. So I realized that there is nothing that fills up that gap. I decided to develop that technology that requires no internet. So that means you can still communicate with your device using GSM or telephone companies. Because telephone companies, well, you know, they earn a lot from us, right? We do make calls, they earn money. The problem, and also another good part is that they got this huge telephone networks all throughout the country with 99% coverage or probably 100% for some. Why not use their capabilities, you know, and let the people like rickshaw puller use technology at the same time? This is just a graph of showing like how the voice accuracy level is increasing gradually every year. So now, today, we have come to a point where if you talk to your, just with a use of a sensor, of course, if you talk to your fan and tell it over a phone, turn on, it's going to turn on. And what's funny is that you can do that in Bangla too. You can talk to your fan, you can talk to your phone, you can talk to your software. You can, let's say you're using a, you're using something, right? Let's say rickshaw puller. He wants to know, or you want to know how much is in your bank account. You can know that. You want to send some money on Bcash or whatever. You could do that just by talking. I think that's the world we needed to create. Whereas everybody has an equal playing field, where there is no gap just because somebody knows how to use that SAP product or Microsoft Excel against the person who doesn't know. And just because he didn't know how to use that, he was inferior before. But with this technology diffusion, whereas voice comes into play to mitigate that gap, I think that world is not far away, where you'd find the farmers or the fishermen or even the beggars are counting their monies using their mobile phone just by talking. And I think that should be the platform for the emerging world in order to really fight neck to neck with the G7 or G20s. That's our only option, to get all our people up and running and mitigate that gap between technology and their lives, whereas they themselves, each of them individually becomes a soldier. And that's our collective power. And that's why the G20 today realizes we produce 53% of world's wealth, but we didn't know how to manage it. But with voice, we have a means to manage it today. That means even though we're not educated, we can manage our wealth far greater than they did. Yeah, actually, I'm on the pretty much end of the boring session. So just here, it's a crazy, graph that just shows high learning curve here and high learning curve and large scale service providing. And this is where most of the big companies lies on, Apple, Google, you name it, everyone's here. The problem is no one's here. Low learning curve and high productivity or high level of expansion. And I think tomorrow, somebody should come up with something that lies here. Somebody should fill up that gap. There are a lot of contenders, but somebody should become the winner. And I hope that comes from the emerging countries. Yeah. Well, I talked about it already. So yeah, that's all. So yeah. Sorry, that's it. That meant it was not a joke. It meant end.